Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Holm. I am the Program and Communications Manager at 01. We are an arts nonprofit based in San Francisco, California. For those who are tuning in who are English speakers, I'm going to repeat the instructions around interpretation so you can hear when folks are listening or speaking in Spanish. So the technical item here is that since this is a bilingual event, if you are on your Zoom screen, you can navigate to the bottom bar and you should see an icon that says interpretation. Once you click on that icon, you can select English and you'll be able to hear simultaneous interpretation in English. All right, great. All right, so now we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone. This Artist Talk is a public kickoff event for American Arts Incubator, which is an international creative exchange program which uses digital and new media arts in order to address local social and environmental challenges. It's also an initiative of the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and developed in partnership with us at 01. So today you're going to be hearing from artist, educator, and designer Gabriel Kaprelian, who is also the lead artist for American Arts Incubator, Peru. I want to share with you a little bit about the program design, so you have a little bit more context about where you're dropping in today. So American Arts Incubator is a month-long experience. It's led by an American artist who works with a group of participants in another country. If this were a regular program year, Gabriel would have traveled to Lima to conduct this program, but unfortunately due to COVID-19, like many other programs, we've had to transition to doing this online. So regardless, during this month-long program, the lead artist teaches a series of workshops to share their expertise and also facilitate dialogue around a social challenge. So in this case, Gabriel, who's our lead artist, is going to be teaching both conceptually and technically oriented skills, including things like collective mapping and 3D modeling, while also leading discussions around the social challenge, which in this case is urban development, and exploring what a resilient future looks like for Lima. Of course, coming from this concept that we would be doing this in person and thinking very much that urban development is something site-specific and maybe hard to do in a virtual space, I think we've had a really interesting time transitioning everything online. And I do think that, you know, everyone who's been involved has been taking this as an opportunity to reconceptualize and adapt to the current moment. So I think regardless, we're gonna have a really, really interesting month ahead. So to go back to the program design, after the series of workshops, participants go into a project development phase where they apply what they've learned during the workshops, bring in their existing knowledge, and develop prototypes and projects that address urban development. And at the end of the month, they present those projects to a panel of experts and folks in the community to receive feedback. And there's also another really nice public moment where there is a virtual exhibition that's again open to the public. So that's a little bit about how the program works. And before I turn it over to Gabriel this evening, I really want to acknowledge that this program has been a collaborative effort, will continue to be a collaborative effort. So I want to acknowledge that this program is supported by the U.S. Embassy in Lima, as well as a host organization, which, if it isn't clear already, is UTEC. I'd like to now pass the mic over to Giancarlo Marconi, who is going to be giving some remarks on behalf of the university. So, thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Gracias. Básicamente, un poco corto, quería agradecer a 01, a la Embajada de Estados Unidos, por la oportunidad de sumarnos a un proyecto tan bonito como este, ¿no? Es bonito por muchas cosas, es bonito porque vuelve a poner y vuelve a acercar el arte y la tecnología, lo que es una preocupación para nosotros desde UTEC. Es bonito porque comienza a abordar un problema como la ciudad desde una perspectiva multidimensional, que creemos es como debe abordarse, ¿verdad? No, no enfocada en una sola disciplina, sino en realidad con la participación de diversos ángulos y con bastante creatividad. De nuevo, quería agradecerles de verdad por la oportunidad de ser parte, agradecerle a Antoine la colaboración, a los profesores de arte y tecnología que han colaborado y a Gabriel por venir y darnos un poco de su experiencia en justamente desarrollar nuevas y mejores visiones sobre el arte y la tecnología. Ahora le voy a pasar yo el micro a Natalia de la Embajada de Estados Unidos.
Muchas gracias. Hola, muy buenas noches a todos. Mi nombre es Natalia Molano y soy la agregada cultural adjunta de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos aquí en el Perú. Y es un honor para nuestra embajada apoyar este programa American Arts Incubator en sociedad con la organización cultural Zero One, que está ubicada en Los Ángeles. Bueno, fueron varios los meses de organización para este proyecto. Y desde el comienzo siempre estábamos todos muy emocionados porque esa es la primera vez que el programa se realiza aquí en el Perú. Pero pocos días después de lanzar la convocatoria, a comienzos de marzo, tuvimos que replantear lo que hubieran sido esos talleres presenciales. Pero gracias a la creatividad y la flexibilidad de todas las personas involucradas, desde organizadores, artistas y participantes, hemos podido llegar a ofrecer un programa innovador en forma virtual con el uso de plataformas que posibilitan la creación conjunta. Así que nos alegra poder tener a 26 participantes peruanos, quienes a pesar de la coyuntura están listos ahora para interactuar y compartir sus ideas virtualmente con nuestro artista estadounidense Gabriel Kaprelian. El objetivo del programa va a ser crear obras que motiven a reflexionar sobre la sostenibilidad de las ciudades, específicamente en los tiempos actuales. Este programa American Arts Incubator utiliza el arte y la tecnología para facilitar el diálogo y ayudar a crear comunidades más sólidas a favor de una mayor integración social. En el Perú, nos hemos aliado con la Universidad de Ingeniería y Tecnología UTEC por su liderazgo en este sector en particular. Y quiero tomar esta oportunidad para agradecer a nuestros aliados precisamente. De UTEC, Antoine de la Flor, por su constante apoyo y gran trabajo durante todo el proceso de coordinación, así como a Ada Quintana, quien ha tenido el mayor trabajo más de cerca con todos los participantes que se han inscrito. Y también gracias a Giancarlo Marcone por su liderazgo y apoyo institucional a todo el proyecto. Por otra parte, también quiero agradecer a Nicolás Gómez del Museo de Arte Contemporáneo por facilitar lo que va a ser la exposición de los proyectos al final del programa. Y un agradecimiento muy especial a Maya Home de Zero One, quien ha liderado en realidad todo este proyecto, la implementación desde California. Bueno, esta noche nos emociona también mucho poder escuchar de nuestro artista estadounidense, Gabriel Kaprelian, ya que él va a hablar sobre los ejes temáticos del proyecto y también sobre su trabajo como artista, educador y arquitecto. Al final de todo el proyecto, a mediados de julio, vamos a poder aprovechar una exposición virtual, donde vamos a poder apreciar los trabajos realizados durante todo el proyecto por los participantes. Y esto va a ser en una exposición virtual en el MAC. Y esto va a ser el 11 de julio. Así que a todos los que nos están viendo el día de hoy, a los participantes, amistades, familiares, los invitamos a todos a que sigan esta iniciativa a través de nuestras redes sociales desde hoy y hasta la culminación del proyecto a mediados de julio y para que puedan ver esa exposición virtual. Muchísimas gracias y le doy la palabra a nuestro artista invitado, Gabriel Kaprelian. Bienvenido.
Hola a todos. I'm really excited to be here. I wish I could see all of your faces. It's always a little strange talking into a computer screen, kind of into what seems like a void, but I know there are a lot of other people out there on the other end. So greetings from California. So I guess I will just kind of jump into things here, and I'll be sharing my screen with you. Let's see. All right. Can you guys all see my screen now? Okay, excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maya and 01, Ada, Antoine, Giancarlo, and UTEC, Vanessa and Natalia at the U.S. Embassy for making this program happen in spite of all of the challenges. And thank you to everyone who is joining us virtually, especially to the artists who are going to be a part of the American Arts Incubator, Peru. Today, I'm going to talk about how art, architecture, and technology can aspire to achieve collective resilience through adaptive urbanism using maps, games, and climate fiction. I'd like to begin with this quote by Moshe Mostafavi. He says, "We need to view the fragility of the planet and its resources as an opportunity for speculative design innovations, rather than as a form of technical legitimation for promoting conventional solutions. By extension, the problems confronting our cities and regions would then become opportunities to define a new approach." Given the wicked problems facing cities around the world, I see this as a call for artists and architects to inspire collective optimism for a better future. I'd like to also take a moment to acknowledge the particularly challenging time that we are currently facing, the personal impact that the global pandemic is having in all of our lives and our communities, and the continued fight for social equality in the face of longstanding racism, police violence, and economic disparity, and the looming dangers of climate change, species extinction, and the consequences of capitalist-driven decisions in the Anthropocene. I truly believe that art can be a catalyst for positive social change and collective resilience. In their project, skipped ahead a little bit, early work by the firm, skipped a couple. Here we go. All right, let's see. So today I'll be sharing with you some of the inspiration for my work and also the workshops that I'll be doing with the American Arts Incubator, much of which straddles the intersection of art and architecture. I find this somewhat awkward disciplinary and theoretical convergence fertile ground for discovery. I often differentiate between art and design as design solving problems and art asking questions. But I think the reality is, in fact, something that has far more depth and nuance. Early work by the firm Diller and Scofidio is a hybrid practice that I believe achieves somewhat of a symbiotic relationship between art installation and architectural tectonics. In the project Slow House, speculative buildings are as much experiential space as artistic artifacts. There is an attention to detail and narrative in creating the project artifacts that goes beyond traditional architecture practice, which is typically concerned mostly with creating normative representation consisting of 2D drawings and 3D models of design to win either a project competition or a client's favor. Radical architecture collectives of the 1960s and 70s pushed the boundaries of speculative design existing in the space of paper architecture or unbuilt projects and outside of the imposed reality. These experiments still capture the imagination as they relate to social activism, science fiction, and art movements. I gravitate towards work like that of Cedric Price for his interest in the social obligation of architecture, rather than the aesthetics of its design. The Museum of Modern Art says of Fun Palace for Joan Littlewood that it was conceived as a laboratory of fun and a university of streets. Although it was never realized, unlike other visionary projects of the 1960s, it was fully intended to be built. Designed as a flexible framework into which programmable spaces can be plugged, the structure has its ultimate goal, the possibility of change at the behest of its user. Price was fascinated by new technology and believed that it should both serve the public and further human freedom. He was determined that his work should not impose physical or psychological constraints upon its occupants, nor reduce them to a standard form, unlike typical modern architecture. I'm also interested in how the architect can be a provocateur, to imagine and build new realities. Here, Hans Hollein has created a mobile office that is part performance art and part physical installation. In the image, he is saying, "Hello, this is Hollein. Yes, I just arrived at the airfield Aspirin. Yes, I just finished the house. It will be delivered at once. You can look at it in a second." All from his inflatable new architectural office. I'm curious also how architecture can be a container for social and environmental activism, enabling space for collaboration and happenings. Spatial Agency says of Ant Farm that their work dealt with the intersection of architecture, design, and media arts, critiquing North American culture of mass media and consumerism. Ant Farm produced works in a variety of formats, including agitprop events, manifestos, videos, performances, and installations. Their early work was a reaction to the heaviness and fixity of brutalist movements, in contrast to which they proposed an inflatable architecture that was cheap, easy to transport, and quick to assemble. There's also the broad domain of public space to consider, existing between buildings and consisting of parks, plazas, and sidewalks and streets. In Parking Day, Rebar Group noticed that most of the public space is for cars rather than people. So they decided to put a park in a parking spot and pay the meter for 2 hours. And then they started an international movement. Parking Day is an event taking place in cities around the world and has inspired various other forms of tactical urbanism. No, this is not an art project, although it looks very similar to a minimalist land art sculpture. Rather, these are prototypes for the US-Mexico border wall at the behest of the Trump administration. The firm Rael San Fratello decided to envision what else the border wall could be, to draw attention to the relationship between the two countries and the people it affects. Last year, one of these ideas became a reality, where they constructed teeter-totters on either side of the wall, bringing people from both sides together for play. So now I'll share with you some of my work and background. A little bit about myself. I grew up in a small town called Eureka in Northern California in what is known as redwood tree country. The area has abundant natural beauty and lush forests and a rugged coastline. And I spent much of my childhood backpacking in the nearby mountains. Growing up in Eureka, also, I felt rather closed off from the rest of the world, as it was isolated from any major city. I did not travel around the United States or internationally until after I spent my senior year of high school in Spain. This foreign exchange was really a life-changing event that opened my eyes to art, architecture, and culture. It also instilled in me the importance of transnational experiences to change the way we see each other and the world. I was lucky to engage in more international travel during and after college. I've always brought my sketchbook with me, not just to capture the experience with an image, but to help me focus on the experience through directed observation. I found that I interact with places differently when I'm sketching versus taking photos, and local people were also much more likely to have a conversation with me. While studying architecture in college, I also had the opportunity to travel through Mexico on a study abroad for 3 months. This experience had a large impact on the way I thought about architecture, society, and the environment. At the time, I was reading Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude, where he describes the superimposition of culture in Mexico. While my grandfather grew up in Mexico, he did not pass on any of this culture to my mother or me. I believe that he saw his move to the United States as an opportunity to create a new identity, apart from the connections to the past. The lack of roots in my family is something that I believe is deeply ingrained in the United States. In The American West as Living Space, Wallace Stegner eloquently captures many of the thoughts that I've been processing about my personal experience and the relationship between cities and the environment in the American West. He says, our migratoriness has hindered us from becoming a people of communities and traditions, especially in the West. It has robbed us of the gods who make places holy. It has cut off individuals and families and communities from memory and the continuum of time. American individualism, much celebrated and cherished, has developed without its essential corrective, which is belonging. This became the foundation of my architectural thesis project titled A Land Use National Monument, where I focused on an open pit mine in the California desert. I was interested in connecting the environmental destruction of the mine to its relationship with consumerism in cities, which I believed derived in part to the unrootedness that many Americans feel. The project envisioned transforming the pit mine into a national monument, much like that of a pristine American wilderness. Early on, I began to work through these ideas with a variety of artistic mediums. This assemblage consisted mostly of found objects in the desert surrounding the mine and the town of Boron, California. Apart from artistic experiments in college, my career in architecture began with rather traditional firms. I had been somewhat disillusioned designing solely for wealthy clients when I came across the opportunity to be a design fellow for Architecture for Humanity. With Architecture for Humanity, I was able to work collaboratively with underserved communities around the world, exploring design solutions for social and environmental challenges. I helped manage 8 projects in 5 different countries. And for every project, we had design fellows living and working with people in each city to create a community center with limited resources that would benefit a broader neighborhood and network in what we called architectural acupuncture. Working on international projects was a pivotal experience that led me to graduate school, where I then focused primarily on issues related to climate change. My graduate thesis title, Sea Level High Rise, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Climate Change, is a play on the movie title, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Like the scare of nuclear warfare in the 1950s and 60s, I see climate change as the biggest existential threat facing the current generation. I was interested in the potential of designing speculative futures to address climate change in cities and sparking discussion. Much of my work began through mapping of various social and environmental, infrastructural, and historic factors. Working with my collaborator, Carlos Sandoval, we explored a data-driven methodology that allowed site information to actively collaborate in the design process. The premise was, instead of building walls to try to stop sea level rise, we would instead develop a managed retreat strategy while creating a new resilient architectural design in its place, meant to coexist with the changing shoreline. To do this, we needed to create a data-driven model to better understand the path of rising sea level flooding, future growth of tidal wetlands, while connecting to the existing urban fabric in a constantly changing environment. The work resulted in a variety of digitally fabricated artifacts, such as these models that were shown at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. I continued this project on sea level rise adaptation by focusing on 3 cities around the San Francisco Bay Area to understand how transformations past, present, and future might inform a more resilient design. What I found was that most of the areas affected by sea level rise were in fact built on reclaimed lands, on what used to be tidal wetlands. My design proposal challenges the contemporary framework of city boundaries as static lines, such as a shoreline, instead proposing the shoreline be thought of as a shore area, which becomes an adaptable and porous edge condition between natural ecology and the urban environment. The historic and future maps were particularly informative in developing a speculative vision of an adaptable city that can coexist with sea level rise. And with this project, I also created more digitally fabricated models that served as physical artifacts. My first artist in residence was with the software company Autodesk at their Pure 9 workshop in San Francisco. Here, I had access to an incredible facility of digital fabrication equipment and design software. I wouldn't exactly call the work that I created their art, but much of it involved mapping, building off of my previous architectural research. However, rather than try to create speculative designs, I was much more interested or perhaps obsessed with creating place narratives through maps and geospatial data visualizations. This began with San Francisco Past, Present, and Future, which is an interactive mapping sculpture. It allows the users to manually layer maps on top of each other to uncover historical transformations in the city of San Francisco. The idea was to use LED lights to project the maps onto a clear 3D printed topographic surface. From an angle, the maps are obscured as they project onto the topographic surface above. Viewed from the top, the maps reveal the hidden and layered history of the city. San Francisco Archipelago took the concept of sea level rise to its logical conclusion by envisioning what the city would look like if all the ice in the world melted. Rising approximately 60 meters, it creates a series of islands out of various neighborhoods, submerging much of the city and creating a new identity. This sketch illustrates my design process, considering what I will show and how I will physically fabricate the piece. The project was primarily a process of translating digital maps into physical material through various forms of digital fabrication. This involved using subtractive CNC manufacturing with wood and combining that with additive 3D printing highlighted here with LED lights. Social topographies of San Francisco focused on creating data narratives through geometric visualizations. Since much of San Francisco's character is connected to the hilly topography, I was interested in creating alternative topographies that described various social data. This process involved collecting publicly accessible data and using parametric software to correlate the information and geometry geospatially to create representative forms. Last year, I participated in a faculty fellowship at Temple University, where I'm assistant professor of architecture. It allowed me to contribute work for an exhibition about architecture and play at the Milwaukee Museum of Art. I've been using board games as a teaching tool in my architecture studios for a number of years, and so I decided to fabricate my own sea level rise board game. The board game was somewhere between architecture projects, an art installation, and a functioning board game. The game was envisioned to be both collaborative and competitive, where characters had to work together to adapt their city to sea level rise. Each time around the track, the sea level rise is 1 foot. Chance event cards representing environmental, economic, and political factors could change the course of the game. While players had to work together to build a resilient city, each player also had their own goals to win. Would the players work together to create a shared vision of the future, or focus on their own agenda? Rather than starting from nothing, like most board games, this one is sited in a real place. In this case, the Mission Bay neighborhood in San Francisco. The game begins from the present, where the site becomes an additional character, helping to inform strategies through past and present maps. The idea of the board game was to inspire collective optimism, to help diverse communities tackle the complex challenge of climate change together through creative communication. And here you can see the installation at the Milwaukee Museum of Art. A couple of summers ago, I spent a month living on a fjord in Norway during an artist-in-residence at KH Messen. I arrived without a plan of really what I was going to do, which was both liberating and a little bit terrifying. My proposal was to explore the concept of genius loci, or spirit of place, developed by the Norwegian architect and philosopher Christian Norberg Schultz. And I planned to explore the relationship between architecture and landscape. Like a good tourist, I began by taking photos of the buildings and then reassembling them into unexpected compositions. However, over time, I felt as if I was learning too little from these two-dimensional building collages, and that I needed to, in fact, construct my own dwelling. I wanted to create a dwelling that could serve as a space for observation and contemplation. The result of my effort ended up being much more about the process of the work and discovery rather than the product. Collecting driftwood from the beach each day and watching the shadow move around the structure as if it was a clock. I spent most of my time observing the landscape and constantly changing climate, and thinking that the best work I could do was to create a frame for the environment. The original idea of the building, or building a dwelling out of reused wood and driftwood, was to create a temporary installation that would be burned during the summer solstice festival on the beach. But either fortunately or unfortunately, they liked it so much that they wanted to keep it around. And here's a picture of the open house with local residents, which I always find interesting to explain work about a place to the people that live there and hear their ideas about it. So the last project that I'll share with you is floating habitat pods. This was part of a public arts grant that I received to create a temporary installation at Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia, the oldest botanical garden in the United States. The project was connected to the University of Pennsylvania's Environmental Humanities program and Ecotopian Toolkit, a 3-day symposium that brought together interdisciplinary artists, activists, and academics to consider how art and design can address climate change. I collaborated with 3 of my architecture students at Temple University to design, fabricate, and install the project. Each floating habitat pod had native wetland plants to create a micro shelter for aquatic animals, while also serving as a public reminder of our collective responsibility for their survival. The floating habitat pods were installed in the Schuylkill River to draw awareness to the human impact on the native habitat and endangered animals. At night, solar LEDs create a beacon on the river with the city of Philadelphia in the background. So now I'll share with you some of what you can expect from the American Arts Incubator. I'm very excited to serve as the lead artist in Peru. I see my role in part as facilitator and curator, but mostly to amplify the voices of the local artists participating in the program. And I very much look forward to having conversations where we can learn from each other. So I've not yet had the opportunity to travel to Lima or Peru, unfortunately. So most of what I know has been learned in research and communication with partner organizations over the past year. In addition to the rich culture and history, one thing that has struck me is the juxtaposition between what I've heard called the two Limas. Like many places in the world, it seems that the gap between rich and poor has only grown. For this program, I'm especially interested in how this manifests in the built environment. Additionally, I've been focusing on public space in Lima, how it is used and how the past and present intersect. I found the story of how the Pizarro Monument was moved from its location near the Plaza de Armas to the Parque de la Muralla, particularly fascinating. Questioning how history is remembered in public space has been something that has also been an active discussion in the United States in recent years. The specific social challenge that has been selected for the American Arts Incubator Peru is that of urban development in Lima. With such a broad topic, I've decided to focus on public space. We will frame Lima's public space in the context of past, present, and future, considering how it will be affected by the global pandemic, civil unrest, and climate change. Public space will serve as the collectively owned, democratized canvas for participating artists to address these social challenges through art and technology. The first workshop will involve collective mapping, where each artist will add images and narrative of their own personal psychogeography of Lima. Each of us experience the city differently. We will discuss individual memories of place, how the pandemic is changing the present conditions, and what this means for the future. The second workshop asks the artist to travel to the year 2100 and send a postcard from the future. How does the past and present frame our perception of the future? How might we envision social, environmental, and technological changes through speculative visions and stories? And the third workshop will be a collective project to create a monument to the pandemic. By discussing how the global pandemic is affecting our lives and the function of the city, artists can consider what a representative monument might look like. Here's a photo of Dolores Park in San Francisco with social distancing circles. The workshop will demonstrate basic techniques of digital modeling, 3D scanning with the use of photographs, and digital mesh editing. And the fourth and final workshop will introduce virtual and augmented reality as platforms for immersive digital environments to connect with each other and the greater community, while we shelter in place during the pandemic and beyond. Augmented reality will bring digital creations by the artists into their physical environments. This past fall, I did a fellowship at the Exploratorium and Art and Science Museum in San Francisco, where I created augmented reality for the map room. Additionally, I've been using virtual reality devices like Google Cardboard, which will enable artists to enter into an environment of their own creation. And at the end of the program, the creative work of the artist will be displayed in a virtual gallery that I will help create. This will allow visitors to join in an immersive digital environment and view the work in a museum setting. And lastly, I want to thank in advance additional partner organizations that will join as our guest speaker panels and artist presentations. This includes Monument Lab, Gel Architects, Ocupa tu Calle, and the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gabriel, por la exposición. Vamos ahora a pasar a la rueda de comentarios y preguntas. Por favor, puede poner las preguntas dentro del chat y se las vamos facilitando a Gabriel. Tengo una pregunta que ya estaba puesta en el chat de parte de Alexandra, Gabriel. ¿Cuál fue tu objetivo principal cuando diseñabas? ¿Cuál ha sido, digamos, tus objetivos y tus motores para realizar tus diseños?
Yes. Thank you for the question. You know, I think it's a great question, and it's something that I think changes with each artwork. You know, as you can see, often the artwork that I've created is trying to address some sort of social or environmental challenge, and find creative ways that I think people can engage with the work and develop some sort of knowledge or stance on the subject, or that it draws at least awareness to these issues. I think the great thing about artwork is that it can be more accessible than maybe just direct like scientific information, but I'm especially interested in how science and data can be used artistically to inform people's understanding of these issues, but also using different mediums to allow them to engage and think about it differently.
Gracias, Gabriel. Una siguiente pregunta de parte de Betsadia. ¿Cómo evalúas tú que este momento para la producción del diseño público es un momento paradójico, tomando en consideración el tema del COVID y que en las ciudades hay muchas aglomeraciones, sobre todo para la parte del tránsito? Tomando en cuenta ese contexto, ¿cuál es digamos, el desafío del diseño público? O si es un momento paradójico, por así puesto de manera textual.
So I think if I understand the question, it's really asking about the challenges of designing for public space, given the global pandemic and maybe other contextual problems such as environmental issues like climate change. Well, I think one thing I also want to kind of draw a distinction is maybe where the role of art versus design. So, I think with this program, I'm certainly much more interested in the asking of questions and developing platforms to inspire people and also engage in discussion rather than just try to solve problems. And also I would say with, the intention of trying to solve a problem, making sure that we don't go into it thinking that we know the answer or that we can do it by ourselves. With that said, I think, what we're facing right now really, are unprecedented challenges, both from climate change and the global pandemic. And, I think in many ways, it's something that design can help with, but I think it's also something that is really going to take people to think differently and also be more compassionate, I think, for each other. So how art and design can do that, I think, is really an ongoing question.
Otra pregunta, Gabriel. Se menciona que los carros son una necesidad y a la vez que un problema. ¿Cómo podríamos tomar en consideración la necesidad de los carros, el manejo de estos en una ciudad como Lima? Sí, sobre todo pensando en los sitios de estacionamiento, ¿cómo podría tomarse desde la parte de la planificación?
Yes, cars. Well, yes, they are necessary right now in many of our lives because that's how things have been designed. And, I think it really takes kind of, almost like science fiction thinking, such as what if we woke up one day and there were no cars? Or, we don't necessarily have to think about what might get rid of cars, but can we think of what we can do if we did not have cars in the streets? If we did not have to worry about parking spaces? What could we do with all of that space? How could we use it? So I'm more interested in asking some of those questions right now rather than, how we can get rid of cars in the first place, because I think, that's something that is likely going to take time. And, but I think we can envision, for instance, maybe the year 2100, what does the city look like without cars? And what can you do with the streets? Can it be a place for people and communities rather than for cars? And also, I just want to say, parked cars take up so much wasted space. It's if every car was a self-driving car and was just going around picking each other up, if your car was parked, it would be losing money. So maybe technology in some ways will change this in the future.
Hay preguntas acerca de tu valoración en torno a ciudades como Lima que están marcadas por las profundas desigualdades territoriales, las profundas desigualdades de clase que se traducen en desigualdades territoriales. ¿Cómo hacer una planificación en ciudades tan desiguales? Y también en ese sentido preguntan, ¿qué opinas de estas intervenciones o de este famoso muro que se llama el Muro de la Vergüenza, que divide dos distritos en Lima, uno muy pudiente de uno que es un distrito joven empobrecido?
Yeah, I think, that was something that is a problem really everywhere around the world. Some places, I think, more acute or more of a grave situation than others. But I really think that social inequality really is at the core of most urban problems. When we talk about crime, when we talk about health problems, when we talk about education, it really stems from inequalities. And so, it's difficult also to think about, what are the solutions to fix that, but what are the ways we can bring people together? Certainly a wall is not one. I find walls really, pretty much any kind, do not work well and make the problems worse. But, if there is a wall, what can we do with that wall? How can we even think about taking down that wall, if not physically, at least symbolically, through interventions, through reaching out? So how can art and architecture be empathetic with people and try to bring people together? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's at least, I guess, some of my aspiration for art and architecture.
Otra pregunta acerca de tu percepción, Gabriel, ¿cómo puedes evaluar esto que está sucediendo en distintos espacios públicos donde se están tumbando monumentos relacionados a las figuras coloniales y a los procesos de colonización de los territorios? ¿Cómo evaluar esas acciones y qué nos deja el futuro?
So I think I'm understanding the question is what are my interpretations of taking down monuments such as colonial monuments in Peru? So I mentioned the Pizarro monument and how it was moved. Yeah, I found that interesting, you know, because it very much mirrors, I think, what is happening in other places around the world, certainly in the United States, where, you know, there are symbols of history, which, you know, a lot of people don't agree with that, you know, are in public space. And I think it really is up to the people to decide how they want to remember that history, or remember, or at least have, you know, a space that they feel comfortable with. And so I know in, for instance, the United States, there are a lot of monuments from our Civil War in the South that are aggrandizing some of the leaders of the South, which was fighting for slavery. And so many people find those offensive and have been trying to take them down. So, you know, it's said that history is written by the victors. And, you know, I think that really what we know is history is built by so many people. And so I think the public space should be for and represent all of those people, rather than just, you know, some guy riding a horse pointing off into the distance. So I don't think that that person represents most people.
Hay varios comentarios felicitando tu charla, Gabriel, de lo mucho que ha gustado. Hay un par de preguntas que tienen que ver sobre qué podemos decir acerca del avance de la unión del arte y la tecnología, y también de la unión del arte con la arquitectura, y cómo estas uniones pueden ser útiles para los procesos de la educación. ¿Qué se puede aprender para la educación acerca de estas nuevas intersecciones o de estas intersecciones de estas disciplinas?
Okay. So I think there's maybe even multiple questions in this. I heard that, what do I believe kind of the potential for art and technology, or art and architecture, and also its role in education. So I think, you know, art and technology I find particularly fascinating because this technology is just moving so fast. And you know, I think that there's always some new form of technology that, you know, on one hand, businesses are developing it because they want to make money off of it. And artists, in many ways, try to find ways to use the technology for their work. I think there is a pitfall if artwork just is trying to use technology just to be new and catchy. But I do think there's always potential in these. I think, you know, these new spaces with like virtual reality and augmented reality, I think there's really an opportunity to create immersive environments that people can share. You know, with augmented reality, you can create something that somebody else can visualize in their house, right? You can also create with virtual reality an environment that somebody with a, you know, $15 cardboard headset can put on their face and look around and view. These are powerful tools that are becoming more and more accessible. And so I think that, you know, going back to the question with, you know, art and architecture, that's also something that's near and dear to my heart, because I believe that architecture is thinking spatially, it's thinking also socially, and it's thinking about how can this engage in broader space of cities and public spaces rather than just inside of a museum.
Hay otra pregunta sobre cómo trabajar en los espacios públicos. En Lima, el problema de la inseguridad ciudadana hace que las personas pongan rejas, controlen los accesos a los parques. ¿Cómo podríamos pensar en recuperar esos espacios públicos considerando este problema social?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the issue of using public space, how public space is accessible to everybody. Crime is certainly one of those barriers for many people. And so I think, you know, one idea is that public space can create community, that then there is a community resilience to crime. People look out for each other. You know, maybe sometimes that's easier said than done, but I think, you know, for instance, looking at work like Ocupa Tu Calle, which is part of Lima Como Vamos, and they are bringing together communities to build better public space for the community, and then they have a stake in representing that park or tactical urbanist intervention. And so I think, you know, I'm excited to learn what is happening in Lima right now, while also, you know, looking at what groups like Gel Architects has been doing. Gigo Di Tomaso, who will be joining us, has worked extensively in Latin America, in cities, looking at master planning and public space design, along with Monument Lab, which has really been thinking about how public space is represented. So, you know, how that, you know, how we make spaces safer, I really think is about bringing communities together.
Otra pregunta, Gabriel. Nos parece geniales tus diseños para los espacios públicos. ¿Cómo podríamos hacer para invitar a la ciudadanía a la participación de la creación de estos espacios? ¿Qué tan factible, hasta qué punto se tiene que invitar a la ciudadanía? Y por otra parte, ¿cómo podríamos incentivar a las autoridades locales, a los alcaldes, etcétera, para que también se sientan parte de esta planificación y tomen parte de tus proyectos?
Yeah, well, you know, I heard this question really as, you know, how do you create these type of projects in public space in Lima? And, you know, that's something that I think every place is different. I do not know Lima well. So I'm excited to hear more about, you know, some of the challenges and the ways people are getting together and creating space. So I think Ocupa Tu Calle will definitely have some answers to that. I will say, though, that I think every place has some similarities in that, you know, if you can inspire people with a vision and that inspiration becomes infectious, people start believing in it. And when they are able to do something themselves rather than also just have something done for them, then people are going to feel much more engaged in that final product. And, you know, city planners, mayors love to take credit for that. You know, it's, if you say, hey, I have all of these people, we want to create this space and make it better, you know, and it's going to cost a little bit of money. You know, I think that there's a lot of people who would be pretty excited to also put their name on that and give some money. I hope. When I was working at Architecture for Humanity, Architecture for Humanity really started as a volunteer collective of architects and designers and community activists, where we would, basically it was a series of different chapter networks in every city. We would work with communities, and then we would also try to just get in contact with our local representatives in the planning department and City Hall, and try to get them to help us create projects. And so it was really ground up. And I think that's, you know, often where the best projects start from.
Gabriel, ¿tú nos puedes hablar, por favor, de cómo es tu metodología de trabajo a la hora de desarrollar este tipo de proyectos? ¿Cómo comienzas esta planificación?
Yeah, so how do I start planning for my projects? Well, you know, I would say every project's a little different. I think I gave kind of a variety of projects, but many of them I think have similarities that I think you saw, that there's usually some sort of analysis that starts with mapping. And I think mapping is really a broad category because really it's any type of geospatial information. So this could be walking around the neighborhood, taking photographs, maybe creating a collage of different elements from the city. You know, there's various ways to kind of map. It really depends on what information you want to get. And this is part of the design process. So I see this as creating a collective memory of place. Then that mapping is something that helps inform me in what type of intervention I might do. And so the intervention might be something that is a speculative design that might be to inspire people of what to do, or also something to show an alternative reality of what we maybe don't want to happen. So it creates a discussion. Or also creating just platforms that are interactive. So for instance, the board game, where that is allowing people to come together, play, and have a discussion. So I'm very much interested in something that creates interactive work so that people feel more engaged. People don't like to be told what to do, and they don't like something that is either, you know, sometimes too abstract that they don't understand, or too simple that seems like you look at it and you understand it right away. So if there's some way to engage with the work, I find that much more compelling.
Ya voy a completar una parte de la pregunta acerca de la metodología que tiene que ver con si tú desarrollas, si tienes un desarrollo intuitivo cuando ya estás haciendo un trabajo, o si prefieres partir de la información. Cuando tú ya estás desarrollando un proyecto, tu metodología cambia, se adapta. ¿Cómo podrías definirla a lo largo del tiempo?
Great question. I would say that probably the most important thing in my process is to just understand that the design process is cyclical, it is iterative, it is not a linear process. It never is. And if it is linear, it probably means that you're not reaching the full potential of what you could do. So yeah, oftentimes I begin with some sort of, like I said, mapping or assessment, but that's not to say I don't have preconceived ideas. I do think it is dangerous when you already have an idea of what you want to do at the end. And so you don't allow yourself to think about other possibilities or allow information to come to you as you work on it, right? So something I tell my architecture students frequently is that they need to get the ideas that they have out of their head and create something. And it's going to probably be bad because it's, you know, the first stage of the design. And that once you create something, that project that you're making is going to have a dialogue with you. You're going to have a conversation with it, and you're going to work on it. And then after you do something, it will talk back to you and so forth. If you're just having a monologue in your head and you already know what you're going to do, then I think that it usually falls a little bit flat. So I think the ability to adjust as you work on things and to have a dialogue with your project is very important.
Lima es una ciudad que tiene muchas desigualdades, y esas desigualdades se traducen en brechas que son digitales y de acceso tecnológico. ¿Cómo podemos planificar teniendo en cuenta esas brechas tú puedes decir que son un reto?
Yeah, unfortunately, technology, one of the big problems with it is that it is not equally distributed. And, unfortunately, for this program, we were originally planning on being inside of UTEC and using all of their amazing resources. So, now we are going to be, everybody's using their own devices inside of their own house. And, that creates challenges. And then even to think about a lot of people who, would like to also be part of a process like this, or create things that don't have the resources. So that's probably one of the biggest problems with technology and access. I do think that there are ways to engage with people. Even a lot of people nowadays who may not necessarily have much money still have a smartphone. Certainly not everybody, but I think there are a lot of interesting things such as virtual and augmented reality they can do just with a smartphone. Creating QR codes on walls that then opens up, a whole other history of things, right? Putting things like that in public space. And I think also understanding where technology maybe is limiting and when to then look at more analog approaches. So I think not being bottled up by technology.
¿Cómo podríamos imaginar el futuro o la ciudad del futuro en los asentamientos humanos, en los barrios más nuevos y jóvenes de la ciudad? Los asentamientos humanos son lugares de alta densidad poblacional y con poco acceso a los recursos básicos, ni tampoco muchos espacios públicos. ¿Cómo podríamos pensar una ciudad del futuro para estos sitios?
Yeah. Well, it's challenging. It's challenging to think about how places that are, very poor will ever change. In some ways, I think that that's maybe part of our role is to think about what the possibilities could be. Like I said, rather than trying to think of how to get there, what kind of the ideal scenario might be. So, it could be something that is very realistic, a step-by-step approach. But I think also it could be a bold idea of let's jump forward to, the year 2100 and what would we like to see? How would we like things to be? And then we can work backwards and think about how we got there, right? Develop a story, develop a fiction, a climate fiction, a science fiction, create a vision. So, I think you don't have to have the answers for that, but at least have maybe some of the vision of what it could be.
Gabriel, ¿qué es una ciudad?
What is a city? I thought I was going to get the question, what is public space? What is a city? That sounds like a trick question. What is a city? Besides I think a great reading would be the book Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, where he describes all of these fantastical cities that don't really exist, and they're all very metaphoric, but they're all still cities, right? So we're going to create a city on Saturday, tomorrow, where we will be collectively mapping Lima, and I think that's really what it is. It's about a collective experience and memories of a place, and everybody's city is different. So, what is your city might be different than what my city is.
Bueno, luego nos dijeron que en realidad la pregunta iba orientada a qué es el espacio público, ¿no? Pero tu respuesta ha sido satisfactoria. Muchas gracias. Eh, Tengo una pregunta de arriba. ¿Nos puedes hablar acerca de esos delfines que estaban expuestos en tu presentación? ¿Son delfines de verdad? ¿Por qué estaban ahí? ¿O es una figura metafórica?
Yeah, I think you're referring to a futuristic rendering that I created where they are sea otters or sea lions that are swimming in the water that used to be one of the streets in San Francisco. So one of the projects I didn't show you, I developed a website that allows you to look and layer maps past, present, and future digitally on a web-based map. And also there are historic photos of places in the city. So what's really interesting about cities like San Francisco is that the whole downtown was built on what used to be the bay. So there's these old photos you can find where there's this bay called Yerba Buena Bay that basically has all of these ships that were docked there. All of that was filled in, and the financial district was built on top of it. So this vision of the future is really the sea level rise retaking back what used to be part of the bay. So that's why I superimposed the bay and the waters and the animals that would live there on the current San Francisco. So it's really just about creating a vision that is something that could happen to make people think a little bit about what is actually there now and what might be in the future.
Sí. Gabriel, creo que ya hemos cubierto las preguntas que había leído. Aquí aparece una nueva. ¿Podrías explicar cómo el cambio climático favorece o impacta a la arquitectura?
Well, I think on one hand, you can say architecture also impacts climate change. So, architecture in cities have a huge effect on climate change and global warming. How we build things really does affect our climate. And, one thing that you may be familiar with is called urban heat islands, where places that used to have forest and bushes and streams have been turned into concrete and asphalt and buildings that use lots of energy. So these places have become much hotter. And so the way that we build really impacts climate change. How climate change impacts architecture, is also a big issue too, because things are getting hotter. The climate is changing. Places where it used to not rain, it rains sometimes, or it gets even drier. So, cities will have to adapt, and cities are really not designed for adapting in most places. So, we're really going to have to think outside of the box to solve some of these problems. So I think that's why things like climate fictions and speculative design are important, to think outside of the box and think about what some of the challenges and potentials are. Thank you, Maya, for posting Urban Heat Island.
No problem.
Sí. Son 8:20 de la noche. Tengo un par de preguntas más, Gabriel. ¿Tú crees que existe en el público una distinción entre su percepción del arte físico en los espacios públicos frente a una representación virtual?
Well, I think I think it depends. So virtual versus physical. It really makes us think about how right now what is public space, really? It's not a space that we can really enter in many places. We are quarantined at home and doing social distancing. So what does that mean for public space in the near future? I would say right now, public space for many people is the internet, is forums like this. This is virtual, right? But it's also interactive. You know, what that means in the future, you know, obviously, like I think not being able to go into physical public space and have physical contact with people makes us realize how important that is in the first place. What is the role of virtual and augmented realities in that space? I don't know. I don't think it can replace it, but I think it can add to it. And I think it can bring us together while we are social distancing. You know, I think there's also various other types of artwork that take place in public space, from something that is physical to something that, you know, is static versus something that can be moved around. It could be something that is projected, is temporary, comes, you know, at different times of the day or year. It could be performance. It could be sound, right? So there's so many different ways that I think we can be thinking about public space and art rather than, you know, just a static monument as well.
Hay una pregunta que aborda el tema de las desigualdades, pero dentro del Perú. Y bueno, voy a intentar leerla. Dice, en Perú, las plataformas de arte y arquitectura venden hacia el extranjero la imagen del Perú como un país pobre e indigenista. Y eso suele ser un capital muy atractivo al extranjero, pero en realidad nos evidencia una brecha y una brecha en los accesos tecnológicos. ¿Cómo puedes evaluar este fenómeno? Y cómo también puedes evaluar de qué tanto impactaría la tecnología en las zonas rurales, el acceso a tecnologías en zonas rurales y a personas que no dispongan, a artesanos que no la dispongan.
So I think there was a lot of things in that question, and I'm not sure if I got all of that. You know, I think that there, you know, it's talking about maybe some of the perception by foreigners of a place, which I think is, you know, certainly always the case. I think we always, you know, come with certain preconceived ideas about place. I remember looking at some research on the barriadas and finding out that there were tours for foreigners to come travel through the barriadas and take photos, which I found, I think, a bit offensive, albeit at the same time, maybe some people in the barriadas are benefiting from that. So I think there's always a kind of this idea that there is a preconception. Now, I think the other part of maybe the question, maybe that was a statement, was talking about the limitations of technology in maybe some of these rural areas. And, well, you know, as much as I am you know, an adopter of technology, and it's very much a part of my work, I don't necessarily feel like every place in the world needs to be completely connected and full of technology. I think it, on one hand, allows us to engage in the modern world, and there's a lot of possibilities. I think on the other hand, I think it changes society, it changes the way we operate, and I don't think it's something that we should impose on places or think that they need necessarily. I do think that, for instance, it can help with things like education and information, but also, you know, I think there's terminology that is used oftentimes of third world country or developing nation, with the idea that all of these countries are supposed to be like the United States at some point. But of course we know if every country is like the United States, we would deplete all the resources in the world in a decade. And, you know, so not everybody can live like the United States, not even the United States. So I do think it's dangerous thinking about the fact that everywhere needs to have technology constantly, and that we all have to be consumers. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack with that question, or at least my interpretation of what that question is.
Gabriel, creo que con eso hemos acabado ya la ronda de preguntas. Yo tengo una pregunta personal. Aunque no has conocido Lima directamente, ya tienes una percepción acerca de cuáles son los principales problemas que hay en nuestra ciudad. En una visión más optimista del futuro, ¿qué crees? ¿Cuál será uno de los impactos más positivos que nos traerá el tiempo y de acá a unos años? ¿Cómo podemos reinventar nosotros los limeños nuestra relación con el espacio público de aquí a un tiempo futuro?
Well, Antoine, thank you for the question. I think I would be really jumping ahead too much if I was to try to answer that now. I think maybe you can ask me and everybody else, all of the artists, that question at the final review, because I think, like I said, that's certainly not something that I can answer. It's something that I would love to be a part of a conversation with all of the artists and yourself. So, you know, with that, I really look forward to what the artists will be creating and the thoughts that they have to answer that question and many more.
Sí, es una pregunta en realidad que podríamos tratar de responderla al final de los talleres,
Yes.
Después de un debate conjunto. Pero bueno, hasta ahí hemos llegado, creo que con todas las preguntas, ya esta parte está concluida. Y bueno, Gabriel, no sé si quieras dar unas últimas palabras a modo de cierre.
Well, I just want to say, muchísimas gracias a todos. It's really pleasure to be here, to be participating. I would have loved to be there in person, meeting everybody, individually and working with you. But, I think we are all up to this challenge. I'm certainly very much looking forward to the workshops and helping develop the work over the course of the next month. And really excited to meet all of the interdisciplinary artists tomorrow during our first workshop. So make sure that you know where to go. I'm sure all of you have been in touch with Ada. And yeah, thank you everybody else who has been making this happen. It's really been a process since almost a year ago. So now it's finally here, and it's really wonderful. So thank you.